Welcome to the Mirror Mental podcast. My name is Jeremiah Emmanuel. I'm 20. I'm a youth activist and entrepreneur from London. I'm joined by the amazing Remy Blumenfeld, Forbes columnist, business coach, and all-round amazing person, and he's my mirror mentor. Today we'll be discussing how to be heard by others. Do you often feel as though no matter how clearly you think you're communicating, your needs and motives get misinterpreted? This is because everyone in your life is listening to you through a powerful filter, the filter of their own needs, which transmutes what they hear.
I love the George Bernard Shaw quote. He said, "The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place." So I think that I've expressed something really clearly to you, but what you've heard is something completely different. And in a way, if you could imagine that everybody in your life was wearing sunglasses, right? So that I had bronze Ray-Bans on and that your mom had pink rose-tinted filters on her sunglasses and that your brother had silver aviators, you'd recognize that what they were seeing was different to you, because my world would look bronze, your mother's would look rose, your brother's. It's the same with listening. Mm-hmm. Everybody is hearing us through their own story about life, their own story about themselves. And so what we say goes into the echo chamber of that hearing. And I think the sunglass analogy is powerful because when you see someone and you recognize that they are actually wearing headphones which are transmuting what you're saying, it just helps you to communicate into their listening a little bit better.
So what are some of these powerful filters?
Well, it has to do mainly with how we see ourselves. So, for instance, if you think of a simple request, something like, I don't know, Jeremiah, would you redraft this report? Okay. If the filter of your listening is, Remy thinks I'm just his skivvy and he's just handing me stuff he doesn't want to do, then you'd be hearing that as he's just giving me stuff he doesn't want to do. He's lazy. You'd be thinking that, right?
Yeah.
Or if you thought, Remy thinks really highly of me and he's trusting me with something really important, then how you'd hear it would be totally different. So it's just important to know how the other person is hearing so that what we say can speak into that filter. Because for instance, if I knew that you thought that I was just giving you shit to do that you didn't want to do because I was too lazy, I would speak into that listening. And instead of saying, would you redraft this report? I would say, I really value your skills in being able to redraft this in a way that will make it better. And I'd be so grateful if you would do it. And then that would help you to hear it in the way that I meant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not sure if many people are familiar with the work of Marshall Rosenberg. He said, needs are the energy of life, the fundamental motivation for all behaviors. Behind every action, there's a hunger to meet needs. Dr. Marshall Rosenberg worked worldwide as a peacemaker before founding the Center for Nonviolent Communication. So the MVC process he pioneered supports partnerships and resolves conflicts within people, in relationships and in society. Something that is, often overlooked. Our fundamental human needs determine what we hear. As he said, Rosenberg lists 9 fundamental human needs. Think of these as 9 basic filters through which you are being heard. So you've got affection, creation, freedom, identity, recreation, understanding, participation, protection, and subsistence. When you communicate something simple to a colleague, such as, I'll be leaving work early today, they could hear it in one of many different ways, depending on what motivates them.
Yeah, I just love those 9 fundamental needs. Because if you say I'm leaving early to someone whose filter is creativity, right? They might think, what? Oh, great. Jeremiah's probably going to an art class, or he's going to be doing some after work learning. If that's my preoccupation, I might think that's what you're doing. On the other hand, if they're driven by identity, they may assume that you're telling me that you're leaving early because you want to let me know that you're important, and that you can leave early, and you're telling me because you don't need to ask my permission. So if someone's driven by identity, they might think that you were saying it to assert your status. And that same simple statement could be heard as he has personal problems, or he's doing a creative workshop, or he thinks he's more important than I am, just depending on what your fundamental needs are. Yeah. So all I might have said was, I need to leave early. And depending on what your fundamental human need is, you'll have heard it in one of 9 different ways.
Yeah.
And if I know what your filter is, if I know, to go back to the sunglasses analogy, that you're wearing a bronze filter, and that bronze filter is around caring, then I'll say, then I'll be clear about why I'm leaving early. And I'll also be clear if I know that you're driven by identity, to make sure that you don't think that I'm leaving early as a way of saying I'm more important than you. And I'll just take the extra step of saying, Jeremiah, I need to leave early today because I've got some personal issues at home to deal with, and I hope that that's okay with you.
I've got a perfect example.
Yeah.
When I was in secondary school, I engaged in so many extracurricular activities. I was involved in youth politics. I was a young mayor of Lambeth, the London borough in which I'm from. And you had 2 sorts of teachers in my school. You had the first type of teacher who said, Jeremiah, brilliant. Anytime you need after school, go and do what you have to do and work towards your future. But then you had the second type of teacher who believed that what I was doing was distracting me from having a good quality education, and I was overwhelming myself with other work and not focusing enough on school. And as a 15-year-old going through this, I didn't necessarily understand why there was such a difference. But now that you've sort of described it in this way, I now have an understanding that, everyone could have a totally different perception depending on who they are. And all of these fundamental human needs, again, determine what that individual will hear.
And think of it like table tennis. If you know how the person you're playing table tennis with is likely to serve or respond, it enables you to hit the ball in a way that either catches them out, or if you want to help them out, enables them to catch it if you're playing with someone who's not a good player. And it's just that same way in a conversation. It's a bit like tennis that way. So you have responsibility as a speaker, because you're speaking into someone's listening. So if I know that you have a chip on your shoulder about status, then I'll make sure that I'm going to say, I'm leaving early for work today because I need to do something important, and I hope that's okay with you, rather than just saying it like a fact, which you might interpret as a status thing. But also, we have responsibility as listeners. So it's not just the speaker who has a responsibility, it's the listener. So for instance, in that silly analogy, if you were listening to me saying, I'm leaving work early today, which you made to mean he thinks he's better than me, he thinks he's more important than me, he's pulling rank, you have a responsibility too, because you're not at school anymore. It's not a pupil teacher thing. Now it's adult. So you could say, Remy, how I'm hearing that is you think you're more important than me, and you're telling me that you're leaving to confer your status. Is that how it is? And then I have the opportunity to go, no, I didn't mean that at all. And I don't think I'm more important than you. I just was saying I'm leaving early, and maybe I should have said it differently next time. So you have an ability to check with the other person. I think it's a really powerful tool in work, in your personal life, to always say, what I heard is this. Is that what you said? Because sometimes we actually create a whole new story out of the facts. In this simple example, the facts were just me saying, I'm going to be leaving early today. But what you heard will depend on what your filter is. And so you would have added a whole extra level of meaning to those simple 4 words. And it's really useful just to check in with the other person. if your filter is creativity and you had this whole story going on that I was going to be doing an after work creativity workshop or after school learning, you could go, oh, are you going to be doing some after school learning? I'll go, no, I'm going to fix the car. But instead of living through the story that you've made up, you're now working with something a little bit closer maybe to the facts. So it's really useful to check in with your listener. And it's also really important to check in with the speaker.
So I've got a question for you, Remy. How can we speak into a colleague's listening? You know, since other people's perceptions of you can become your reputation very, very quickly, you may want to take responsibility not only for how you communicate, but also for how what you say is perceived by the listener.
Yeah, so, you know, we just use that example of when you're the listener, you can own it you can take responsibility by saying, what I heard is, you think you're better than me and you're conferring status. Is that how you meant it? In other words, take responsibility for what you heard and play back what you heard to the person who spoke. You can also do it the other way around. So in your example, as a colleague whose reputation is really important, a great way is to say, how did you hear that? So if I've just said to you, Jeremiah, I'll be leaving work early today, and I have any sense in the way that your face is reacting or any sense in what you have or haven't responded with, I can always check in with you and go, just want to check in how you heard that.
Yeah, yeah.
Or I just want to check in with you what you heard. Or just want to make sure that I was heard correctly. What did you get from my communication?
Yeah, because it's also really important to make sure that you're being heard correctly. Your communication and the chance of you being understood will only improve if you also clearly explain your own motivation. Letting your listener know what is behind your action or request will make it less likely that they will layer their own incorrect interpretation. You know, if you request to leave work early and it is driven by subsistence, you could also add, maybe you could add, you know, the childminder started early today and I really want to avoid having to pay double the time after 5 p.m. Alternatively, if you're simply motivated by freedom, make it clear by adding, being able to leave early from time to time is one of the things that I love about this job, don't you? Apart from that, though, Remy, are there any other tricks you would say?
Well, I think by repeating back what you've heard and asking the speaker if that's what they meant, you know, that's a really good way of just checking in with the person to make sure that you got it right. It's really about never taking for granted that what you've said is heard by the other person, and never taking for granted that what you've heard is what the other person said. Always understanding that we add layers of meaning which weren't there, and that other people do it too. So as a listener, I'm making what you say means something different from what you perhaps intended. And as a speaker, your listener is doing that too. So it's just checking in all the time. And when you're aware of what someone's particular bias is, if you know that someone has a bit of a chip on their shoulder about status, speak into that listening. If you know that somebody really values the workplace and it may not feel that you do the same, make sure that they know that you value it. I think what I often get with clients is them saying to me, well, they know that. You know, I'll say, have you told your boss how much you love this job and how much it means to you? And they'll say, oh, well, they know that. And I'll say, well, how do they know that? Oh, they know that. If you haven't said it clearly recently, say it clearly recently. Whatever it is you want to communicate to anyone in your life, personally or professionally, make sure that you've folded it into what you're saying so that it's not there in the background as something you think they know. I know that you respect me. I know that you like me. Say it. Just say it. And it helps color the filter. So if you want them to see it through a rose-colored filter, put the rose filter on what you're saying.
Exactly. Let's talk feedback in a work context.
It's one of the most challenging areas, and particularly for your Generation Z,
because
hate feedback.
there's a lot that's been published on how leaders should give feedback. But I believe the real art is receiving it. We receive feedback as a threat sometimes. Do you have some techniques which you find useful to apply in these sorts of situations?
I think the first thing when it comes to feedback is to realize where we stand in relation to it. So if I say to you, just imagine this situation. Imagine, it could be me. I'm saying to you, Jeremiah, I have some feedback for you on our last meeting together. See, I've seen immediately what happens. Your arms fold. It's a defensive thing. Because when we hear the word feedback, we immediately defend against it. It doesn't matter who it's coming from. It could be from your closest friend or your partner. It doesn't matter who's saying feedback. When you hear feedback, we act defensively. So when you hear the word feedback, I want to give you some feedback. What happens to your body?
I do believe that you do get the negative effect.
And what colors do you start seeing?
Red and sort of dark and misty.
Yeah. So it's very akin to this whole conversation about listening. When we listen to feedback, most of us already have a response, which is defensive and angry and red and negative. And we may have different response. It may be sadness. It may be depression. It may be the colors may be different, but nonetheless, it's not around honesty, openness. Oh, wonderful. I'd love to hear your feedback.
Yeah.
So that's a very important first thing when it comes to feedback, that we hear it immediately as criticism and we defend against it.
It should be seen as constructive criticism. And that's a term that I learned when I was quite young. Through the army cadets, and whenever we had something to do or we had a lesson, we would get what we called constructive criticism from our adult instructors. So I guess we all hear feedback as criticism, which we are hardwired to reject immediately. Feedback is a word. Feedback is a word deliberately chosen for its neutrality. It's intended to be neither positive or negative, neither criticism nor praise, just feedback. However, I don't think it's always perceived in this way.
No, it really isn't. And that's why, although the word itself should be neutral, it's come to have such a heavy meaning for people that you can't say, I want to give you feedback without people acting defensive. And what's happened in recent years, and it's thanks to the cosmetic queen, Mary Kay, who devised what has come to be called the shit sandwich. Because what she would do, and what many managers still do, thanks to her technique, is they say, I have some constructive criticism and I've got some positive things I'd like to say. And they might even say, Jeremiah, you're here for feedback, and I just want you to know that you're a wonderful team member and that we value you very much. And that's the whipped cream on top. And all you're doing, you don't even hear that. I might even say, you're a wonderful team member and you're a great contribution. And here are 10 things that the team really love about you and 10 things that we think you can build on because you're doing them so well already. But your listening is, and what's the bad part? Because it's a shit sandwich. You know that that's the whipped cream and there's shit coming. So you don't even hear the positive stuff or the stuff which normally we'd be delighted to hear because you're expecting the negative.
Yeah.
And I think this has all to do with our sense that there is positive and negative. There's constructive feedback and there's destructive feedback, that there's good stuff and there's bad stuff. The truth is, in an ideal listening, and it has to do with how we perceive it as much as how it's said, feedback is a way to repeat the things that we're doing well that work and avoid or lessen the things we're doing unsuccessfully that don't work. And it's no more than that. And if it's understood in the sense of imagine in a relationship, it sometimes helps to transpose these hostile work situations into a more loving situation. If your girlfriend said, look, I want to be with you forever, and there are some things about how we interact that really work that I'd like to discuss doing more of because it's so great. And there are some things which I find difficult, which I'd like to have that be less of. You'd be open to that because she's already said, I want to be with you forever. And it makes perfect sense. Of course, there are some things that really work for me and some things that don't. So I'd like to do more of the things that work and less of the things that don't. That's what feedback is in an ideal situation at work. It's just saying, here's what we could learn from our mistakes, and here's how we can learn from what's working well. But you have to be open to both. And the thing is, when we shut down on the here's what's working well that we could do more of, we also shut down on the here's what's not working well that we could do less of. So Mary Kay, I think, has a lot to answer for in that respect, because her shit sandwich, it was designed to help, but it just doesn't. It's always better to be really straight and direct and honest about feedback.
But with that being said, I believe we turn our feedback about our actions into attacks on who we are, and attacks like our personality and who we are as a human being. You said that human beings are meaning-making machines, and the meanings we make up as adults are shaped by the negative meanings we made up when we were children. Was there a moment for you as a child when you made up a meaning about yourself?
Yeah, there was, and I'll share it with you, only on one condition, that you will tell me the story about your childhood where you made up a meaning similar to mine when I'm done. Will you agree to that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Then I'll tell you my story. And this relates to the filters that we wear and how we got to be wearing that particular shade of filter on our sunglasses, the particular listening that we have. So it relates right back to the very beginning of this conversation when we were saying everyone has a different listening. And until you know what their listening is, you can't speak into it and you won't know how they're hearing you. When I was about 5 years old, I was sitting at my parents' kitchen table in Cambridge, and I was writing a letter that my dad had asked me to write out to a cousin in New York. I don't even remember meeting this cousin, but I guess she or her mom had sent me a book, and I was being told by my dad to write a letter to my cousin thanking her for the book. And I did. I took the pencil out and I took the paper and I wrote the note. And I gave it to him. And I was about to get up from the table and he said, wait a second. This really doesn't look very good. There are a lot of mistakes here. Now, those were the words. I don't actually remember if those were exactly the words that he used, but I think those were pretty much the words he used. It doesn't look very good, and there are a lot of mistakes here. But up until that moment, Jeremiah, everything I'd done had seemed perfect to me and to everyone else, because I was a child. So every little potato print, every little thing I'd made seemed, was wonderful. Everyone was I got 5 gold stars, like children do. And now this wasn't good enough. This wasn't good enough. Okay, so I did it again. I wrote it again, this time taking more care to do with my handwriting. And he gave it back to me again with corrections, spelling mistakes I'd made and corrections on the little piece of paper. So this went on about 4 or 5 times. And by the time this finished, I had made up a story that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't good enough for my father, that my father didn't think I was good enough. All that had happened was he'd asked me to rewrite this letter. And I've since, as an adult, spoken to my dad about this moment, and he's reassured me that as he saw it at the time, although he doesn't remember that particular moment, his whole thing was, you're a gifted little boy, you need to have the bar set a little bit higher. People have been saying you're doing brilliantly when in fact you could do a lot better, and I want to help you be as good a writer as I possibly can help you to be. So he was just doing it to be helpful. He didn't have any idea that as a child I'd made up a story that he didn't think I was good enough. And to cut a long story very short, I went through life from that moment until I was in my 20s with a story that I wasn't good enough for my dad. So that was the filter that I was hearing everything through.
Yeah.
And when these things happen to us as children, it's always the first words we heard that were negative as a child. It could be, you fat little girl, you stupid little boy, do that again. And obviously I've coached a lot of people in the intervening years. And what I've noticed is that very often people who become like Supreme Court judges were the little boy that was told you're a stupid little boy, or made it mean that. The people who become supermodels were children who thought they were fat or ugly. We create an armor to protect ourselves from what we think is this terrible truth. And so you might be speaking to a supermodel who you might think had all the confidence in the world, and you might think she knows she's so beautiful, right? And you might say to her, I don't like that skirt. And how she'd be hearing it is, he thinks I'm ugly. And you wouldn't even occur to you to think that. You might be talking to a Supreme Court judge and you might say, I'm not sure what I thought about that latest paper you wrote. And he'll hear it as, he thinks I'm stupid. And it wouldn't even occur to you to imagine that, because these people are so successful, because we create the armor to protect ourselves from that childhood story. So I'd love to know from you, what was the first memory you have of someone saying something negative, or that you perceived as being negative to you when you were a child?
I think I was in year 9 in secondary school, or year 10. So around the age of 14 to 15. I'm still very young myself, so not too long ago, but I do believe many things have advanced in this short space of time. Now, religious studies was a subject that I was really, really interested in. My background, I'm a Christian, and my family was sort of raised up that way, and religious studies was just like a natural thing to me. However, when it came to my exams and practice exams before GCSEs, I had a teacher who sort of made me feel underwhelmed. I would do my exams and I would always score a D or an E, or even, I think one time I received an exam paper back and it was an F. And I had to sit down with this teacher, and I was actually in the top set at the time. And he said that he feels, due to the pace of the class, he didn't feel that I had the ability of a top set student. And what he actually done, he had moved me 2 sets down to the second set to the bottom. And at that moment, I felt really disheartened, because this was something that I felt was embedded in me from a very, very young age. It was like human nature to me. But now I had been told that I wasn't good enough at something, and my ability wasn't up to the standard of everyone else. And it really affected me.
What did you make it mean about you?
I thought I wasn't good enough. I thought I wasn't smart enough. I wasn't intelligent. Again, not saying that everyone who was in the class that I was in felt the same way, but I just believed that I deserved to be in the class that I was taken out of. And a few years down the line, when it came to my GCSEs, I sort of channeled this and tried to put it into my work. And from the age of 14, receiving D's and E's and F's, I had actually turned it around so fantastically that I left my GCSEs with A star for religious studies. And I scored, after sitting 4 exam papers, I scored an A star for each one. And again, I had this situation when I was a few years younger, and I felt that I couldn't achieve anything in this area. I wasn't intelligent enough and I didn't have the ability. But when I moved to that class, I said to myself, I do have the ability. I think after a year after, I started saying to myself, I do have the ability and I am intelligent, and I have been taught this area subject from the beginning of my life, so I should know loads about it already. And I was able to then turn that scenario in which I was a bit younger and I was sort of told what I was from that perspective, and I turned it into myself receiving an A-star in my GCSEs.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
And the interesting thing about that story is that you created an armor around that horrible feeling of I'm not good enough by actually deciding that you were going to be as good as you could possibly be, and getting those A's. And quite often, why feedback is difficult is because it strikes at the core of two very basic human emotional needs.
Yeah.
One is to learn and grow and be the best we can be. And the other is to be accepted exactly the way we are. And so feedback challenges both, because we want to be told you're just fine how you are, don't change. And at the same time, we recognize that to grow and learn and evolve, we need feedback.
Yeah.
But we resist it because we so crave to be accepted. What we really want is for our boyfriend or girlfriend to say to us, you know, I want to be with you forever and I just want you to stay exactly like you are and don't change anything. However, in any relationship, in order to grow and in order to be the best partner one could be at work or at home, one needs often to evolve, to learn.
Because although we can only improve by being corrected, we always resist feedback. It's just something that I feel happens. And why do you think that is? I know you've mentioned a bit of it, but if you could delve into...
I think that really is, it's about that basic human need to be accepted that's being challenged, as well as our desire to learn and grow. I think that's what it strikes at. I think that's why it's particularly hard.
I think another thing I find is that we don't remember what's actually being said. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, people just tune out in feedback because if you're not aware of the fact that you have this reaction to feedback, you can't really change it. So people do what you did when I said, I'm going to give you some feedback. They cross their arms, they go into defensive position, they don't hear. It's like, la, 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 la. I'm not going to hear the good stuff. I'm not going to hear the bad stuff. But then they do that other thing, which people always do, and it has to do with the filters through which we hear. They just remember the thing that suits their story. So if the story you're carrying around is, I'm not good enough, then that's all you hear in the feedback process. And your colleague might have said 5 wonderful things, and they might have said 5 ways in which you are delivering to standard, but you'll just hear the thing that suits your not good enough story. And that's what you'll remember. And that's why it's a very useful thing to, in feedback, as with normal conversation, ask the person to repeat what they said or repeat back to them. So what I heard from you in this feedback session was that you'd like me to show up on time, that you'd like me to be there ahead of time so that you feel recognized. Is that what you said? And then the person can go, yeah, that is what I said, or no, I didn't quite mean that, or whatever. So you feedback what you've heard.
Yeah.
The interesting thing that people who've studied feedback have noticed is that we tend to gravitate towards people who tell us what we want to hear about ourselves. And that's not always the most helpful form of feedback because it's selective, you know, and it's also not the best way to learn and grow. If you only surround yourself by people who say you're very prompt and you always arrive on time when in fact you're late.
No, exactly. Having catalogued what you see as being the 6 biggest obstacles to being able to receive feedback, what are a few tips on how to transform feedback into the precious gift that it really is?
So proactive listening, which we touched on, really important. Maintain good eye contact with your speaker. Also, at the end, just listen with open body language, good eye contact. And even though you may be thinking, I don't agree, I hate them, they're wrong, at the end, just say thank you thank you for sharing so openly with me what's going on.
Yep.
I would like to take it away to consider it and really do that. It's really important to sit with feedback, not to react in the moment to what's been said. Take it away, sit with it, let it sink in, spend a couple of days considering it and evaluating the feedback. You know, you may want to let some of it in. It's like going to a store and trying on a jacket.
Yep.
It may fit. And if you take it home and wear it over the weekend, you may actually like that jacket. On the other hand, you may want to return it to the store because it may not be quite right for you.
Yeah.
So it's not because someone said it that it's true, but it's true for them, and some of it may be true for you. So sit with it for a couple of days, see if it fits. If it doesn't, go, well, this bit worked and it's true, and I'm going to take that on and make some changes. This part I don't feel really applies to me, and I think it's that person's listening. It's not really true for me. The other tip I would say is don't wait for feedback. Because you know that if someone comes to you and says, I've got feedback, you're going to act defensively. Whereas if you come to me and say, I'd really love some feedback from you on how to be a better friend, a better colleague, a better mirror mentor, if you're asking for it, then your listening will be different.
Yep.
Because you know that it's a contribution because you've asked for it. It's not something I've thrown at you that you have to defend yourself against. It's something you're asking for, so you welcome it in. So ask for feedback.
Yeah.
It also makes people feel more comfortable about giving feedback if you've asked for it. If it gets to the point where they feel they have to give it to you because your relationship's kind of going off the track so much, there can be some extra tension because they've been feeling like, oh, Jeremiah's always late or Jeremiah never listens for so long. Whereas if you ask for feedback, they're able to give it to you early, and that often saves a lot of tension. There's 3 really great questions that relate to feedback that I think are really useful to ask in any situation. In a friendship, in a work situation, what are you getting from me that you want more of? So that's basically positive feedback.
Yeah.
What are you getting from me that you'd like me to do more of?
Yeah.
Second question is, what are you getting from me that you want less of?
Yeah.
Not saying you don't want any of it, just less. And what are you not getting from me that you want? So what can I do more or less of, and what can I bring to the table? And once you've asked those 3 very open questions, because they are the secret to good questions is they're very, very open. Once you've asked those and listened to the answers, your relationship will be able to improve in ways that are just impossible to list, because it just opens up a whole sense of possibility.
Yeah. In summary, feedback is not always negative. Sometimes it might be someone who is actually trying to look out for you and they just feel that you have a number of things to improve on. Or maybe it might just be a comment in terms of how to live your life differently in a better way. A term that we've used in this podcast is constructive criticism. And we shouldn't always feel attacked when someone has a piece of feedback to say back to us. We must always recognize that different people have different perceptions. So in terms of the way you feel that someone who's really close to you may react to something that you might say, your employer or a colleague at work might not react in the same exact way. So it's very, very important to recognize that different people view from different types of lenses, and just understanding how you can accommodate each of those conversations as they happen. Thank you for listening to the Mirror Mental podcast with myself, Jeremiah, and Remy, and we look forward to meeting you again in the next episode.